So I'll be talking a bit about the importance of ubiquitous broadband, gaps in deployment, adoption, and usage, as Professor Warwick has just abundantly dealt with in his very thoughtful talk, how to mitigate those gaps, things that have been attempted around the world, and providing a few concluding thoughts for you. So that's where I look to go for today. Now, as far as the importance, every talk that we've heard this morning, today, has focused on this importance. There's a huge literature on it. Study after study found substantial gains in GDP and GDP per capita as a result of broadband deployment. And of course, broadband deployment has been recognized in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. So I think there's no question that broadband is needed. As Professor Warwick said, it's the foundation of pretty much everything else. It's the basis on which the digitalization of society is built. And as Professor Suhono just told us a few minutes ago, it's a fundamental enabler, a fundamental catalyst to the modernization and digitalization of society. Now, many different benefits, economic development, government services, education, healthcare, you name it. There's just a lot that flows from the build out and take up of broadband. We saw that during the pandemic. Work from home played a very important role for knowledge workers worldwide, clearly different in some societies than in others. But the internet as an enabler of work from home, as an enabler of conferencing, as an enabler for workshops like the one that we're conducting at this moment, played a huge role. This is data that my team developed from SimilarWeb, showing for Apple users the spike in the use of Zoom at the point when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. So again, the benefits worldwide are quite substantial as an enabler then to pandemic response at many different levels. What we also know from the crisis that we see from the unprovoked aggression in Ukraine, internet is also important as a source of communication, as a source of news, independent news. And we shouldn't underrate that. Now, internet, like many things, has a good side and a bad side. It's not all good, but there's a lot of good that can come from internet being ubiquitously available. When we talk about gaps, again, I would endorse what Professor Warwick was saying. There are different gaps with different implications. I usually focus on three measures of internet take-up. The first being coverage, whether it's available everywhere. The second being adoption, whether people actually take it up, subscribe to it. And the third being what they do with it, how they handle it after they have it. So with that said, here you have OECD data, and this is a chart, country by country among OECD members, of take-up of the fixed network. And even among OECD countries, which are among the most developed in the world, you see that there are substantial gaps in deployment of the fixed network as you get to the lower end. But what we also know is that in many parts of the world, the fixed network doesn't reach the full national territory and won't for a long time. Much of the literature on this has been written for the cities of the world, the developed countries, countries that already had a fully deployed copper telephony network at the dawn of the broadband age. The problems elsewhere in the world can be different, and in parts of the national territory, in many parts of the world, the mobile network is the network. So a balanced approach to fixed and mobile that recognizes this is important. This is ITU statistics, so it takes in a much wider range of countries. This is coverage. And as you can see, the coverage in developed countries is near universal. But when you look at less developed countries, and also particularly when you look at landlocked countries that are not at the top of the GDP per capita list, coverage tends to be much less. It's getting better over time, but it's less. And we know the reasons for this. I've done work, by the way, in Southern Africa. I've done work in Peru. Getting work to the big cities in Peru on the coast is easy. Getting it into the Andes and into the jungles beyond in the interior is hard. And this is a problem that I think is well known to you in Indonesia. I think that's what we heard in the rural coverage discussion. Highlands and islands are always a problem. Indonesia has both. And here you see also that when we look at adoption, at subscriptions per 100 inhabitants, that can look a lot different from the coverage. But of course, it can't be greater than the coverage. So getting coverage to everybody, getting everybody onto the net is important, needs to be a goal for everyone in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, when we look to mitigate the gaps, it's important to note once again, the countries are different. They don't all have the same problems. They don't all have the same issues. They differ greatly in terms of wealth. Think of GDP per capita. Think of disposable income. That looks a lot different in some countries than it does in places like New York and Paris. The degree of digital competence on the part of the public, their ability to use the services once they have them. As Professor Warwick said, affordability is a key issue, but digital skills is another very crucial issue. So the existing coverage of fixed networks, mobile networks, and in some countries, cable networks, plays a key role in what can be done and what's achievable. Even the physical characteristics, things like the length of copper subloops, can play a big role in what's achievable and what's not. But one of the biggest factors, of course, is physical topography, highlands, islands, again, access to submarine cables, these all play a role. And once again, important to recognize adoption, deployment, use, they're different things, and the tools to deal with them are also different. So a one-size-fits-all solution is not appropriate. Now, with a lot of these, money plays a key role. One of my friends likes to say, the answer is money, what's the question? So there we go. And that does play a role. It's really a ubiquitous theme. Now, on the regulatory side, a lot of work has been done. I would particularly call your attention to a set of OECD recommendations on broadband. They were first issued in 2004. They were updated for the first time in 2021. I had the honor of writing one of the preparatory studies for that work. I think you will also find the study helpful. But clearly there are different tools, and a lot of these are well understood from experience worldwide. Promotion of competition through regulatory tools is one. Addressing resource constraints, especially things like spectrum allocation and assignment. Access to land and rights of way, clearly a key issue. We heard some discussion in the earlier presentations about the need for towers. This is part of the same issue. The simplification of permitting and licensing procedures. A lot of cases, the deployment in principle could be funded. It's just hard to get it out because the permitting process is so time consuming and because it's delegated to such low levels within government. Public subsidy can be a key answer, but it needs to be done with care so as not to crowd out private investment. I'll be spending a few more minutes on that. The promotion of network reliability and resilience is important. It's not just a matter of ensuring that the connectivity is there, it's also a matter of ensuring that it stays there. And of course, many countries are prone to natural disasters, some unfortunately also to man-made disasters. Indonesia knows about natural disasters. So again, planning for resilience has to be part of the process, and also do attention to things like consumer protection and periodic assessment of the state of the market. I'll talk about that more in a moment. Now, in terms of increasing funds available, foreign direct investment can play a role. Many countries are less open to this than they probably should be, but total openness also isn't possible in a world with increasing geopolitical tensions because of the risk of security associated with crucial telecommunication resources. Co-investment can be a good answer in some countries. Co-investment can take place among multiple network operators, can take place in the form of sharing infrastructure, mobile towers, I think, being a good example. But also there are interesting examples worldwide of infrastructure sharing between network operators and other firms, for example, electric utilities. We see a very good example of this in Ireland, for instance. But then direct public financing, where it makes sense, where it's feasible. And this is something, again, some of the developed countries have been resistant to this, but it has its place. Now, once again, very important to ensure that public funding doesn't crowd out private investment. One of the things that my team is looking at as part of our T20 work is the repurposing of a portion of new tax revenues that can be expected through the OECD G20 revision of corporate taxation. That's expected to increase tax revenues worldwide by about 150 billion per year US, and also to redistribute 120 billion. That's a big chunk of change. We're trying to assess exactly where it goes. There are some OECD estimates on this. Given that the companies that will be paying in are largely digital online firms, especially US-based firms that benefit from broadband worldwide, there's a certain social justice in saying that countries that wish to retarget or repurpose some of those revenues, they could be spent for anything, but some of the countries that wish to repurpose for expansion of their broadband infrastructure, this is a source that probably isn't in current budgets because nobody was expecting it. Debt financing, clearly a means of stretching the dollars, bringing them forward. Institutional international lenders are one source. Within Europe, we have something called the Resource and Resilience Loan Facility that would be a good source of debt financing. Basically, interest rates are low. If you're going to do it, this is a good time to do it. Now, a clear point is that participation in the digital society isn't optional today. It's a big deal. It's a big deal for everybody. It requires intervention not just on supply side, but exactly as Professor Warwick said, also on the demand side. So direct subsidies in terms of supporting the cost of broadband for the poor, for the disadvantaged, clearly has a role to play. Demand aggregation can play a role, but a big deal, I think, is also education and training. And this is a need for digital skills. It's a need that's perhaps given a sharper point due to the need to work from home under the pandemic, so that shift to remote work. But also it was a long-term issue anyway, due to the progressive replacement of certain jobs, repetitive mid-level skill jobs mostly, not low skill, by automation, by digitalization, by artificial intelligence. So the need to shift to lifelong learning is a major theme. Policymaking, good policymaking clearly has a role to play. Explicit identification of broadband goals, comprehensive statistics and mapping, creation and implementation of a broadband plan. You heard Professor Warwick speak about this. And also independence of the regulatory agency from politics and lobbying. This is important. That's important for the regulatory agency, not for the ministry. The ministry's job is inherently political. So one needs to make a distinction here. And I would actually like to hearken back to your Minister for Maritime Affairs, who talked about the need to align mission, vision, and strategy. And clearly you've done a lot of that. I liked what I heard from Bhakti, but it's an area that I think all countries need to pay attention to. So concluding, connectivity for all has become even more important than in recent past. Governments in developed and developing countries need to be paying attention to both deployment and adoption. You need balanced strategies. Different countries face different challenges and therefore will need different targeted, tailored solutions. A balance is needed between supply side measures with innovative funding and adoption and use, which requires different measures, mostly demand side measures, and especially an increased focus on lifelong education and learning. And with that, many thanks. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to have met with you this morning.